Welcome back, Nerglings. Today we are going back to the very start. That's right, it's the granddaddy of them all, Warhammer Fantasy Battle. But before we start, be sure to like, share and subscribe so you don't miss an update. If you fancy switching on notifications too, that would be spiffing. I must be honest with you, I've been putting off doing this video for years, fearing that I couldn't do it justice with my current setup or available free time. But with a new mic and a plan to set aside some time to dedicate to the project, let's have at it, shall we? The year is 1983. Luke Skywalker was busy saving the galaxy from his dad, whilst Michael Jackson had just released Billie Jean. Meanwhile, a little upstart company in Old Blighty was readying itself to change the wargaming landscape forever. Warhammer is set amidst a backdrop of a fictional high fantasy universe, notable for its dark and gritty lore, which features influences from Michael Moorcock's Elric stories, J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, and the deep well that is European history. The setting itself is the Old World, which closely resembles that of Earth due to manipulation by an ancient spacefaring race known as the Old Ones. Establishing an outpost, the Old Ones set about manipulating the geography and biosphere of the planet. With the assistance of their Slan servants, they moved the planet's orbit closer to its sun and arranged the continents to their liking. To travel between the worlds, these Old Ones used portals or warp gates, which they built at the north and south poles of the Old World. Eventually, however, these gates collapsed, allowing raw magical energy and the demonic forces of chaos to pour forth into the Old World. At this point, the Old Ones disappeared. However, before leaving, they had established the Lizardmen, ruled by the Slan, as their servants. In addition, they had created the races of elves, dwarves, humans, halflings, and presumably the ogres, who are assumed to be an unfinished attempt by the Old Ones to create the ultimate race. Orcs and goblins were not created by the Old Ones, nor were they part of their plan, and their origin is not made clear in the setting. Beastmen and Skaven were the result of mutation from raw magical energy at this time. Eventually, the Chaos Demons were driven back by the Lizardmen and Elves, with the Elves performing a great ritual to drain out the raw magic that was flowing into the world and sustaining the demons. Some mighty creatures such as dragons and dragon ogres are stated to have existed prior to the arrival of the Old Ones. After this, the elves and dwarves flourished and created mighty empires, but eventually they were set into a slow decline. A series of civil wars amongst the elves split them into two groups, the malicious Dark Elves and righteous High Elves. A petty war between the High Elves and Dwarves served only to diminish both races further, and caused the High Elves to abandon their colonies, some of whom refused to leave their homes in a magical sapient forest and, over time, developed into the enigmatic and isolationist Wood Elves. A period of seismic activity caused by the Slan decimated the underground holds of the dwarfs, while attacks by Skaven and goblins, who breached the dwarf strongholds from below, only made things more desperate. The humans were the slowest to develop, but ultimately formed several strong nations able to defend themselves from aggressors. The Nekharan Empire, based on ancient Egypt, was the first great human empire, but due to a curse by Nagash, the first necromancer, they became an undead faction known as the Tomb Kings, who now dwell in the Land of the Dead, former Nehekara. Nagash, in his efforts to find eternal life, also created the first vampires, an entirely separate undead faction. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. Let me take you back to the beginning. Alright, where to start with this magnificent tome? Where else but the glorious artwork on the front cover, naturally. Painted by the good John Sibbick and depicting a chaotic battle scene between a bloodthirsty band of adventurers and a group of hapless orcs trying to defend their community from the gold and, no doubt, glory-hungry troop. What follows is the contents page, and there is a lot to get through today, isn't there? Firstly, who are we to thank for this quintessential piece of our collective childhoods? Well, the original game was penned by Brian Ansell, Richard Halliwell and the ever-present Rick Priestley, with the 3rd edition modifications and iterations completed by Rick and Jim Bambra. Graphic design was done by Charles Elliott and Brian George. Illustrations were done by the venerable John Blanche, Ian Miller, Tony Ackland, Chris Arkelios, Angus Fieldhouse, Bob Naismith, Jez Goodwin, Josh Kirby, Gary Chalk, Colin Dixon, Dave Andrews, Nick Bibby, Richard Hook, John Bolton, Russ Nicholson, Jamie Sim, Daniel Loveday, Steve Tappin, Paul Bonner, Brian George, Ian Cook, Will Rees and Rick Scollins. The logo was penned by John Timms and Chaz Elliott, with photography by Phil Lewis and Duncan McFarlane. The miniatures were sculpted by Kev Adams, Nick Bibby, Mark Copplestone, Jez Goodwin, Ali and Trish Morrison, Bobs Naismith and Ollie, and the Perry twins. The miniatures and dioramas were created by a chap called Sid, the young and impressionable Mike McVeigh, Colin Dixon, Brian Ansell, and I might like to add that many of these beautiful models are still on display at Foundry in Newark, courtesy of Brian and Company. Wayne Millard, Kev, already going by the moniker Goblin Master Adams, John Blanche, Dave Andrews, Ali and Trish Morrison, and Phil Lewis. For Renron's last battle counters were designed by Pete Nifton. Meanwhile, the Warhammer World, Old World and the diagrams were done by the mysterious H. Playtesters included Graham Davis, Chaz Elliott, Phil Gallagher, Jervis Johnson, Ken Rolston and John Stallard. So then, Warhammer Fantasy Battle. With the vigour of a primeval cat, the Barbarian leapt upon his enemies, his great broadsword cutting a whirling arc of death and destruction. The leader was first to feel the blade's edge. Bone and armour splintered as his torso was cleft from collarbone to belly. 2 more fell to the ground before they could turn to flee. The others ran, leaving the bodies of their comrades sprawled in a spreading pool of blood and gore. The barbarian made no attempt to follow them, his eyes honed to a keenness unimaginable to the civilized folk of the south, watching the would-be thieves scuttle into the shelter of the night. Amongst the soft-bellied denizens of the city, he was a lion amongst jackals. From now on, the jackals would be wary. The following introduction really summarises and distills what it is to be a wargamer, what you can expect from the book, and hints as to what is coming next. Introduction. Recent years have seen an explosive increase in the number of fantasy films, books, TV programs, and even games of widely varying quality. Good, bad, or indifferent, it's hard to deny that fantasy has become popular. Fantasy is about heroes and monsters, fabulous deeds and terrible battles. All those heroes inhabit unique worlds, but worlds with one thing in common. they are very different from our own. For one thing, magic is real. Eldritch forces and strange races share the world with men, threatening humanity, aiding or thwarting heroes, influencing the lives of kings and changing the fate of nations. In short, fantasy is about imagination, and not just the imagination of writers and film producers, but of everyone who has ever read a fantasy story or watched a fantasy film. To this considerable list, I would like to add the person who takes the process a step further by creating his or her own fantastic worlds, the fantasy gamer. I suppose I should explain what a fantasy game is, although the chances are you are already familiar with at least one of these popular games. There can be few people who have not heard of, if not actually read, one of the many excellent and commonly available fantasy game books. You might also have seen role-playing games such as Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, the sister volume to this one. Perhaps you have taken part in or organised such games yourself. But even if you are a complete newcomer to fantasy gaming, you'll have no difficulty in understanding Warhammer Fantasy Battle. Warhammer is the game that enables you to create full-blooded battles on a tabletop. Your troops are represented by scale models, each about an inch high, or in the case of huge ogres, giants or dragons, even larger. The battle rages over a playing area, which can be a tabletop, a floor, or any area large enough to accommodate the warring forces. Like all battlefields, there are buildings, hills, woods and other scenic features to be represented by models in an appropriate manner. As in real life, the contours of the land and the positions of woods and buildings form an important element in the strategy of the opposing sides. Formations of soldiers try to maneuver around hazards or take refuge amongst cover, as archers and spearmen, wizards and warriors strive for mastery of the battlefield. Readers will have gathered now that Warhammer differs from normal games in that players must be prepared to expend time and skill painting models, preparing scenery and setting up their gaming area. You will have to contribute effort and imagination in playing the game too. In this sense, Warhammer is very demanding. In fact, it's more than a game, it's a hobby in its own right, embracing all aspects of fantasy modelling, painting and gaming. If all this sounds like hard work, you're right, it is. So what makes a fantasy gamer do all these things? I suspect that the answer is just that it is hard work. Creating a magnificent spectacle of models and scenery isn't easy, but once you've taken part in a well-prepared game with expertly painted models, you'll be hooked. Skills can be developed, and you'll soon learn how to paint and model. This book tells you how to go about acquiring vital techniques. Remember, the artists who worked on this book, drawing the illustrations and making, painting and photographing the models, started out as ordinary gamers and hobbyists. I would like to pause there for a second and for you to consider why you love the hobby so much. What keeps you in it and coming back to it, sometimes repeatedly over the years? Is it the narratives you can create during games, the satisfaction of creating something unique to you and your vision, or perhaps you simply enjoy the control you have over the makeup of your forces and the level of detail you can go into with making and modelling them? Or is it the lore and stories of yore? Whatever it is that motivates you to pick up the glue and brushes, keep doing it, young sir or madam. You are doing the hobby proud. While your enjoyment of Warhammer will be greatly enhanced by superb scenery and expertly painted models, they are not essential. To begin with, you may prefer to use the cutout counters provided in this book, in which case you need go to no further expense before fighting your first game. The ever popular card proxy game. If anyone has actually played Warhammer like this, I would be very interested in hearing from you in the comments below, as this strikes me as completely at odds with miniature wargaming, so please enlighten me. Anyway, the clash of armies, the shrivelling bolts of wizard fire and the howling of the undead combine to make a highly enjoyable game. And whether you have a dazzling array of miniatures or simple card pieces makes no difference to the challenge. Your imagination is what counts. Pitting your wits against those of your opponent is one aspect of play which makes Warhammer different from most other fantasy games, where your opponent is usually a book or a series of events interpreted impartially by a games master. In Warhammer, your opponent is far from impartial. He is out to win just as much as you are, and will use every ploy he can think of to do so. In turn, you'll have to meet his every threat, use your heroes to turn the tide of battle, magic to confound your foe, all the time making the best of the individual strengths of your troops and exploiting the weaknesses of your enemy. Golly, it's rousing stuff all right. It makes me want to get out the old dice and have a quick spin. Alright, the rules of the Warhammer game are contained in this book and are set out in a clear, straightforward manner, with numerous examples to help you learn them. A section of advanced rules provides experienced gamers with further detail and ideas. Don't be put off by the length of this tome. The core of rules is quite short, much of the text being given over to describing other aspects of the game, such as the Warhammer world and the many strange creatures that inhabit it. This Warhammer world is a special world, unique to the Warhammer series of games. It has been developed by the authors and contributors over several years into a highly detailed background, comparable to the world described by authors of fantasy fiction. In many respects, this fantasy world is like late medieval Europe, except it is larger, wilder, and far more dangerous, containing a multitude of nameless evils lurking within the heartlands of civilization, waiting to emerge upon the human race in the form of foul servants of chaos. Of course, there is nothing to stop you developing your own world background, or of adopting the background from any book you have read to form the basis for your games. However, by using the Warhammer world, you'll have the advantage of the countless special models available from Citadel miniatures, detailed supplementary playing aids from Games Workshop, and the promise of further support material from the Warhammer authors. Collecting and painting your forces. Whole books and countless magazine articles have been written about collecting, painting, and converting metal and plastic figures. This section introduces the basics of buying, assembling, and painting models for use with Warhammer. Citadel Miniatures are the world's foremost producers of quality metal gaming miniatures. Every single model is sculpted by an expert designer, and the most advanced technical processes are employed to reproduce the painstaking detail. Warhammer has been developed around the Citadel range, and you can incorporate any Citadel models into the game. In addition, special Warhammer figures have been produced in close cooperation with the Warhammer authors and contributors. In fact, some of the sculptors are avid players and have helped to design and test the game, as well as inspiring some of the least savoury monsters. Aside from the comprehensive range of metal miniatures, Citadel have produced a small but growing series of plastic models which are available at greatly reduced cost compared to their metal counterparts. Once painted, they cannot be told apart until picked up, when their lighter weight becomes apparent. Buying models. Although it is very easy to buy a new model on impulse, and I know of few people who don't, it is more efficient to think about your forces and plan your purchases carefully. If you are a member of a regular gaming group, you'll find it a good idea for each player to stick to a particular theme or race. For example, one could concentrate on building an orc force, while another deals with dwarves. Several or all members of a group could collect some human troops, because there are lots of human types to collect, varying from the regular armies of nations such as the Empire to the brigand bands of the border princes and beyond. One player might like to collect monsters. In our own gaming group, it always seems to be the GM who ends up collecting these more way out creatures. Whatever their chosen race, players should try to build up a comprehensive force. The best way to do this is to use Warhammer armies, which I shall be covering in another video, I'm sure. Anyway, you should buy a whole unit at once, usually 10 or 20 models. A unit is a group of creatures fighting together under a single leader. You may wish to think of a unit as a regiment or company of troops. Units fight and move as a single body and are assumed to be identically armed and armoured throughout, although it is not strictly necessary that each model is correctly equipped. If you buy and paint one unit at a time, your armies will grow fast, and you will soon have a usable force to lead into battle. Deciding on your chosen army or race is the easy part. Selecting the models, painting, basing, and preparing them for battle is where the real work begins. However, it is pleasurable work. There are few hobbies as relaxing or rewarding as painting and modelling. By way of example, we'll look at the process of assembling an orc unit. The first decision to make here is metal or plastic, and really this is a matter of personal preference. Plastic is, of course, cheaper, which means it is easier to assemble a larger force right from the start. Here we have opted for a mixed unit of mostly plastic models, but including a few metal ones for variety, and to provide a distinctive leader figure. In total, the unit will number 14 figures. The first step is to buy the models. Citadel figures are now widely available, and any good model shop and even some high street retailers will be able to offer you a wide selection. Wherever you obtain models, try to choose those which are the cleanest and most perfect castings. Because rubber molds are flexible and soft, they do not last forever, and the models they produce may vary slightly from batch to batch. All those offered for sale should have crisp detail and no malformities. Some degree of excess metal originating from air vents in the mould or from metal seepage within the mould is unavoidable, and such models must be tidied up before painting. To obtain our orcs, we took a trip to Games Workshop in Nottingham, whose large stocks offered a considerable choice. After much deliberation, we opted for a box of the plastic Warhammer Fantasy Regiments figures, which contains 10 plastic orcs, as well as figures from other races. In addition, we bought an Orc Command Group pack containing 4 metal orcs. Here we can see Alan Merritt and Jim Bamborough battling it out over one of Brian's tremendous tables, complete with a rather handsome castle no less. Preparation of metal models. Before painting, all metal models should be cleaned up with a small modelling file and or modelling knife. The moulds used to make metal figures come in 2 halves, and seepage between will result in a slight mould line. If the seepage is extensive, it may form a foil-thin metal along the model's extremities called flash. Both mould lines and flash can be dealt with using your modelling knife, the single most useful tool you own. The unwanted metal is easily removed. Venting strands are not imperfections in the mould, but rather a good sign. If the air vents fill with metal, this means no air has been trapped in the mould to produce a little bubble or cavity. If you find any little cavities of this kind, you know it is due to a tiny bubble of trapped air in the mould. But small holes may be acceptable as they are easily filled or painted over. As Citadel models come with a separate plastic base, they will have to be attached to the model before you can start painting. Models specifically intended for this game are supplied with the correct size base. Some models are supplied with round, hexagonal, or other shaped or sized bases designed either for other games or for display. In these cases you can easily fit the correct size base instead. If your local retailer does not stock separate bases, they are available directly from Citadel for a few pence each. As well as individual bases, there are special multiple bases which allow 3 models to be mounted side by side. This makes movement much easier, although you'll have to have some single models to allow for removing casualties. Glue the model to its base with a fast-setting 2-part epoxy resin glue such as Araldite. Now, I must say I don't know anyone who uses that anymore. I use Gorilla Glue or Loctite, both of which work just fine. Spread the glue in the prepared slot and on the corresponding tab before pressing the model home. Personally, I just pop a dab on each foot and a little on the front side of the tab. Once dry, I fill the slot with wood filler so varnish doesn't drip through the gaps later, but hey, that's just me. Don't worry about getting glue on the top of the base, as that will be covered at the next stage. Once the figure has been attached to its base, a decorative ground coating can be applied. The base should match in with your gaming setup and must be done so that it won't appear incompatible, whether your game is fought amidst a forest glade or a ruined city. You can make your bases look like paving slabs, but this will look strange amongst forests. You can make your bases look like foliage, but this will look odd in urban games. Whilst this is a matter of taste, naturally goblin green is the way to go from here. Nothing but goblin green, copious amounts of it. The texture is applied by mixing PVA glue with sand or fine grit, or by using a ready mixed stone filler available from DIY and hardware stores. This mixture can be pasted onto the base's upper surface using a cocktail stick or something similar. Try to avoid getting the glue mixture onto the model itself. The mixture can be left plain or sprinkled with sand, grit or fine modeller's flock when wet. If you like, patches of flock or sand can be glued to the surface once it is dry. This gives the effect of sparse vegetation or broken ground. Whatever method you adopt, it is best to leave the sides of the base plain and undecorated. Preparation of plastic models. Plastic models are moulded in high-resolution rigid polystyrene and are supplied as kits for the modeller to assemble. This format allows a certain latitude in pose and equipment, so no 2 models need look exactly alike. First, wash the whole kit with warm water and a little washing up liquid to remove any grease remaining from the steel moulds. Interesting. I never recall anyone ever doing that, I have to say. Before construction, separate the pieces from the supporting frame using a modelling knife and clean up any mould lines in the same way as for metal figures. Assembly is easy using standard polystyrene cement. The liquid sort is recommended. Carefully apply a small amount of glue to both parts to be joined. Wait a second for the glue to take hold and firmly press both parts together. If the parts remain loose or spongy, you're using too much glue. Only a tiny amount is necessary for a firm grip. The model can be glued to its base at any convenient stage, and the base textured in exactly the same way as for metal figures. Plastic models will feel lightweight compared to metal ones, and may be weighted with plasticine pressed underneath the base. This will stop them falling over quite so much, and gives a much nicer feel. Now that's all well and good, but true professionals glue lead shot or metal washers to their bases. Plasticine indeed. Truly these were dark times. Undercoating. Whether models are metal or plastic, they will accept paint more readily if properly undercoated first. If this is not done, the colours won't show up properly. The bare surface may show through, and the paint will wear away very quickly. That is, unless you're a stubborn old mule like me and paint your models using enamels. You all know what an undercoat is, let's not flog a dead donkey. Paint. Old-fashioned oil and enamel-based colours are rarely used these days. Speak for yourself, sir. As water-based paints are now freely available. These are thinned with water and brushes can be cleaned with water, avoiding the need for smelly, brush-destroying turpentine and white spirit. Those familiar with enamels will find them perfectly good for metal models. All the techniques described for water paints can be applied to enamels. Most gamers will wish to use water-based paints, however, and so only types of this kind have been described. Acrylic paints are based on water, but are waterproof once dry. All the hobby paints are of this type, including Citadel colour, which is specially made for painting Citadel models. All acrylics are mixable and interchangeable. If you find a shade you like from one manufacturer, it will easily mix with paints produced by someone else. As well as the modelling paint sold in hobby shops, you can buy acrylics in tubes from art shops. These are generally thicker than modelling paints and may lose some covering power if thinned. Now this is what I'm talking about, proper hobby tips from our good friends at Games Workshop. None of this only use Citadel paints gobbledygook here, just good old-fashioned advice. Great. Gouache is an old-fashioned sort of watercolour with a glue base. It can be bought in art shops and usually comes in small tubs. Until recently, gouache provided the best colour range for water-based paint. However, as this is no longer true, gouache is best avoided as it is not waterproof when dry and tends to rub off. Some gouache will mix with other water-based paint. This is interesting, as I painted my Citadel giant with a mixture of oils, enamels and gouache, and then gave him a protective coat of quick shade varnish to ensure the colours wouldn't fade over time. He has been painted for about half a decade up to this point and still has a great green hue on his tunic. So yes, I can attest to the colour strength of gouache. However, I would suggest it's probably not a good idea unless you are keen to experiment. Poster paints are a little coarse for our purposes and, like gouache, are not waterproof when dry. However, the metallic paints from these ranges are often excellent and well worth buying. Now, your choice of colours will depend on your subject matter, but you'll need a minimum of black, white, red, blue, yellow, green and brown. I have all these colours in both enamel, acrylic and gouache, just in case, but then I'm mental. What we're really talking about here is carefully choosing which paint to use depending on your requirements. Enamels make great base coats as they are thin and very hard wearing. Coarse or textured paints are best for terrain, while fine paints are best for skin tones, smooth items like cloaks and fine detail. Brushes. Brushes are the single most important item in a painter's armoury. A good brush should be made from sable. It should come to a nice point when moistened between finger and thumb, and it shouldn't have any odd sticking out or overlong bristles. Examine your brush carefully in the shop. Art shops will often provide a dish of water so that buyers can point brushes. Artists take buying a brush seriously, and so should you. What can I say other than excellent advice, although you'd be hard-pressed to find anything like this in shops anymore. Good brushes don't come cheap, so choose carefully. You'll need a number 1 for general work and a number 0 or 00 for fine detail. I mean, that's fine, but if you have old peepers like me, you won't be going near a 00, that's for sure. Anyway, a good number 1 should come to a fine point, and gives as good detail as the smallest brush. A small brush is easier to handle when painting unusually fine or recessed detail. Painting textured bases, applying undercoat, varnishing and dry brushing are very hard wearing on brushes, so use an old brush or buy a cheap one for these purposes. A cheap number 2 or 3 will prove useful for large areas and undercoating. It goes without saying that, having spent a king's ransom on brushes, you will want to look after them. Never leave brushes standing in water, as this will bend the bristles completely out of shape. Clean brushes after use with soapy water and stand them points upwards in a jar. Make sure the bit where the bristles meet the metal ferrule is clean, and tweak off any rogue bristles as they appear. All sound advice, I should say. Basic painting techniques. You'll need a steady, flat surface, good light, daylight is best, at least 1 jar of water and a mixing palette. An old plate or tile is ideal. Protect your work surface with a thick layer of newspaper and place your paints and water around you so they can be reached comfortably. Water should be clean to avoid fouling paint. It is a good idea to have a separate jar for cleaning and thinning metallic colours, otherwise metallic bits will start appearing in all of your other paints. The palette is used for mixing and storing the paint you are using and should ideally be white to show the colours. It is easier to paint several figures at once rather than to complete one at a time. Work through your batch of models, painting all the blue bits, then the red bits, and so on. By the time you have worked through the batch, the first figures will be dry and ready for the next colour. It is usually easier to paint a figure from the inside out, starting with the skin and working outwards through the layers of clothing and finishing with equipment. Initially, concentrate on getting the paint in the right places and don't worry too much about shading or highlighting. By painting outwards from the skin, you'll make it easier to cover up mistakes as you go along, but only practice will improve your technique. In the case of our orcs, we started off with the skin, a pallid green colour mixed from green and yellow paint. The clothing was then added in various shades of brown, red and grey, with weapons and armour in a mixture of black and silver. The last thing to paint is the base, which can be any neutral shade of goblin green, and only goblin green of course. Just kidding, most bases look great with a black edge, especially if you're going to be making movement trays for the little blighters. Improving your painting technique. There are many tricks of the trade that can be employed in figure painting. The ones described below cover a wide range of special effects which will greatly enhance your figures. Black lining is a simple form of shading used to emphasize contrast. Basically, any change in colour or material is marked by painting a black line, or very dark shade of some other colour. For example, where a model's hand appears from its cuff, a black line is painted where the two join, and where a hand grips a gun, a black line is painted to separate the flesh from the metal. This technique looks very good if done carefully, and can be combined with other shading techniques discussed below. Well, I have to say, I've never tried this technique myself. If anyone out there has done this to any great effect, then please let me know how it went. Shading is used for creases in clothing and recessed detail. These can be painted with a darker shade of the surrounding colour to represent shadow. Where a progressive gradation is required, 2 or more darker shades can be used, each shade representing a deeper area of shadow. Painting areas of shadow is time consuming, and most painters prefer to use washes as described later. Highlights are used on raised areas to catch the light and make them appear lighter than their surroundings. This can be represented by painting such areas with a lighter shade of the base colour, in exactly the opposite way to shading. As this takes rather a long time, many artists prefer to use dry brushing to achieve the same result. Now, I would argue that painting and shading a colour on would give you a much better gradient than dry brushing, depending on how heavy you were to dry brush. Washing is a quick and effective way of representing shadows. A wash is prepared by using a dark shade of the base colour and diluting this with water. The ideal consistency is very dirty water rather than thin paint. You must experiment to obtain the right consistency for your needs. This wash is painted all over the area to be shaded, and the paint naturally falls into the cracks and detail, forming a realistic, graduated shadow. Raised areas can be wiped with tissue or a finger to remove any residual paint, but this is not necessary if your wash is sufficiently thin. Some artists use water-based inks to make washes, as these give a harsher shadow, but these are expensive and only recommended for the experienced. Dry brushing is a quick and pleasing way of representing highlights. Prepare a lighter shade of the base colour and dip the brush into the paint. Then wipe away most of the paint, leaving only a slight residue of the light colour. By drawing the brush across the whole area to be highlighted, pigment is deposited only on the raised areas, producing instant highlights. It is important to experiment to find the right amount of paint. Successively lighter shades can be built up if you are careful. Emphasizing details such as buttons, buckles and other small raised items can be accomplished by painting the whole item, plus a small area around it black. The item can then be painted a different colour, leaving a very fine black line around it. This technique can be applied to larger areas before painting, providing a similar finish to black lining. Metallics and difficult shades may need a special undercoat. Metallic paint and some light shades of brown and yellow do not sit well on top of white paint. The white will show through and the finish is patchy. To compensate for this, another colour is painted onto the area as a second undercoat. In the case of red metals, the best colour is brown. Light yellows will go over pale browns or darker shades of the same colour. Paint varies and you may be able to find better colours to suit your purposes. For instance, I recently saw someone use pink as an undercoat for yellow, which then gave a beautiful, rich hue. I guess the best thing to do is experiment, or just don't paint namby-pamby colours like yellow in the first place. Shading chart. This chart shows how, using Citadel colours, you can produce highlights and shadows. Although Citadel paints are acrylic, the chart can be used with all the techniques described above, simply by substituting a different type of paint of a similar colour. When mixing shades, remember the lighter tones are lighter, not whiter, and darker tones are deeper, not blacker. Adding white and black will work to some extent, but if overdone, will simply produce a shade that looks either washed out or dirty. Varnishing. Models will suffer a certain amount of wear and tear from handling and travelling, so must be suitably protected by varnishing. Ordinary gloss varnish is ideal for this. It can be brushed on or sprayed. Varnish can be bought in small modeller's pots, in huge tins from DIY shops, or as spray cans. It will give your models a glossy finish, which some people dislike, although others, myself included, find very attractive. Special matte varnishes are available, but these are less efficient and tend to wear off. If a matte finish is required, it is best to apply gloss varnish first and then matte varnish on top. Now, varnishing is something I'm somewhat familiar with. I like to use quick shade varnish, which comes complete with an element of wash, which ranges from soft brown, heavy brown and dark, almost black. It comes in tins to dip your models like a pro, so you don't have to worry about painting the stuff on, unless you wish to varnish a particularly large model like a giant or chariot. A quick shake in an old rag or piece of tissue paper, and then a cursory check that the varnish hasn't pooled in any inconvenient places, and you can leave it to dry for a few hours. Depending on humidity, it can take some time to cure. Typically, the fresher the varnish, the quicker it cures. Varnish can only be thinned and cleaned with terps or white spirit, so a separate brush and materials will be needed. Most modelers use a spray can and avoid the needs for brushes and terps altogether. I would like to caveat this with being very careful about humidity when using spray varnishes. If there is any moisture in the air, it can get caught in the spray and will dry misty and ruin your beautiful paintwork. The games table. A games table must be large enough that it permits your forces to maneuver effectively. If the area is too small, it will be impossible to exploit the abilities of faster moving troops, while missile troops will find themselves unable to avoid attacks, who, in turn, will find it impossible to avoid barrages of missiles. On the other hand, the table must not be so large as to be inconvenient to reach the centre when moving troops. Furthermore, your table should reflect the lines of battle you are likely to employ. If your playing area is square, troops will either be too far apart initially, or the troops will be squashed, possibly with units having to line up behind others. A table that is too long will stretch out the battle line, ideal if you have hundreds of models, but pointless otherwise. Overall, the smallest area that will prove satisfactory is 6 foot by 4 foot, and an area 8 foot by 4 foot is even better. A smaller table is acceptable if it is squarer, say 4 by 4, but you will only be able to fight correspondingly smaller games. The size of your table will obviously be influenced by the size of the room or the space you have available. Remember, you'll need a certain amount of space to walk around the table once it is set up. A measuring tape will prove essential when planning your table. Make a scale drawing of your room if space is tight, and try to visualize how the completed setup will look. Don't forget, you will need somewhere to put casualties during the battle, not to mention the inevitable gaming debris such as drinks cans, plates of sandwiches, crisp packets and so forth. It's not just armies that march on their stomachs. Having planned where your gaming table is going and how large it is to be, the next stage is the table itself. Practicalities will dictate the design of your table. Will the table be a permanent feature, or must it be cleared away after each game? If it is to be cleared away, what sort of storage space is available or acceptable? For most of us, the setup needs to be a temporary affair, with the room given over to some other purpose for the most part. In this situation, we must make the best of those resources available to us. It may be that you already possess a dining table of suitably large dimensions, in which case your problems are solved. Of course, it will be necessary to protect the table from scratches, not to mention accidents with spilt drinks. An old tablecloth or blanket will provide protection for a highly polished table, and the actual gaming surface can be either heavy cloth spread over this, or special scenic blocks made from polystyrene. An alternative is to place a sheet of chipboard or marine plywood on the protected table, although this will have to be about the same size as the table, as it will sag dangerously if not properly supported. Painted green, such a board makes an excellent gaming surface, which can be stored in a garage, against a wall or behind a wardrobe. If storage is a problem, A single sheet of ply can be cut in half and the two pieces hinged together using heavy-duty duct tape. This may need renewing occasionally, but is better than metal hinges, which would intrude upon either the game or the table underneath. Chipboard is also difficult to hinge effectively. An ordinary domestic table of the dimensions required for a game is, unfortunately, a rare thing. Your dining table is probably no larger than 6 by 2.5 feet, i.e. long enough but nowhere near wide enough. If you can buy identical tables, then this is perfect, but you will have to live with multiple tables in your room. For several years the author had a setup along these lines, with two identically sized tables, one of which doubled as a workbench, the other as a desk. Although both were the same size, one table was about 1.5 inches lower than the other, a factor which was exploited to create valley sides and gradual slopes. A few books under each leg converted the arrangement into a normal flat tabletop. If the cost or practicality of having two tabletops puts this option out of the question, you can still have a full-size table using a single normal-sized table or desk. To achieve this, you'll need to make a proper gaming board that sits on top of your existing small table. Because your gaming area is significantly larger than the table, it will have to be properly reinforced, or else it will sag, or it overlaps the table edges. Furthermore, the uneven distribution of models will tend to make the board slide around or tip over, where it is not supported underneath. This is especially apparent when somebody leans on the table, resulting in entire armies of carefully painted models being catapulted across the room. To prevent your board sagging in use, it must be reinforced by lengths of timber, 3/4 inch or 1/2 inch by 1.5 inch. A length of timber screwed along each underside edge will provide rigidity and protection against knocks during storage. The screw heads will appear on the table surface, so use screws with flat heads rather than round-headed ones. Chipboard is difficult stuff to fasten without it falling apart, comprising of pulped wood held together by glue. Special fastenings are, however, available. Marine ply is lighter and more durable, and is recommended in preference to chipboard for these reasons. Both sorts of wooden sheet are available from DIY stores such as B&Q, Homebase, Texas, etc. Texas, those were the days. They usually come in 8x4 sections, although suppliers will cut these down for you, should you want a smaller piece. You can pick up the timber needed to reinforce the board at the same time. Although 8x4 is ideal for a games table, you might have difficulty storing such a large item in your house. In this case, have the board cut into 4x4 sections, giving you two boards which can be placed side by side as necessary. A heavy cloth of a suitable green colour can be laid to provide a quick, convenient and even transportable gaming area. A heavy grade blanket is sufficient, although I would recommend just picking up a flocked gaming mat for a few quid from somewhere like Hobbycraft. A durable and more easily cleaned alternative is to buy a length of leather cloth used as covering for imitation leather furnishings. Preparing the table. Once you have installed your games table, it is necessary to think about how you are going to use it. You might wish to use the table as a playing surface, or you might prefer to use it as the base for polystyrene scenic blocks or a heavy cloth. If the table is to form the actual playing surface, it will need to be painted in a suitable colour. What constitutes a suitable colour is a matter of individual taste, but most gamers prefer a shade of green, and mid to light but not garish shades seem to work best, such as goblin green. Green blackboard paint is a suitable shade, and you can chalk on terrain if you have none. If the board is merely intended to provide a base for scenic blocks or a heavy cloth, the actual colour is irrelevant, but you may prefer to paint it anyway, just to neaten it up. The illustration shows how both a single or two-part board can be reinforced to prevent sagging. The timber supports are simply butted together where they meet. There is no need to construct a complex joint. In the case of the two-part board, the two halves can either be hinged or drilled to take two or more fastening bolts as shown. If hinged, the board will of course fold in half, but you will have to be careful the hinges don't scratch the tabletop. The edging reinforcement will prevent the board sliding or tipping to some extent, but to really hold it firm, it is best to fasten more wooden brackets as shown. These will also provide additional support and stop the board twisting out of shape. Two lengths of wood are screwed underneath the board between the long sides as in the diagram. They should be positioned equidistant from the centre, and the distance between them must be equal to the length of the supporting table. The addition of these brackets will prevent the board slipping along the table length. To stop movement in the other direction, two more brackets can be positioned as shown here. Again, these must be fastened equidistant from the centre, and the distance between them should equal the width of the supporting table. Note, many tables have slightly curved edges, so remember to measure the greatest width. Now I have to admit to never having gone down this route myself, instead simply playing Warhammer Fantasy Battle on my parents' brown leather mat covered oval table. Not ideal for starting areas, but good enough for a bash. Anyway, in the case of the halved board, the combined central support will cause the board to seesaw when placed on the table. Additional supports must be positioned so they rest on the table edges. Providing additional brackets to hold such a board in place would prove extremely unwieldy. Unless your woodwork skills are remarkable, the best approach is simply to be careful. Now, it may be out of the question for some gamers to utilise the dining table as such. It may be a priceless antique, too flimsy, or perhaps you don't have a suitably sized table at all. Should this be the case, there are many alternatives. A gaming board constructed as described above does not necessarily have to be table mounted. Anything that raises it above the ground will do. Carpentry trestles, for instance. They are solid and stable, although if you decide on this option, you will need to and require somewhere to store them. If you have a room of your own where such an intrusion would be acceptable, the gaming table can be fastened permanently to the wall, hinged so that it drops onto some means of support for the far end. As this prevents access to the hinged edge, the table must be mounted vertically, so that the side fastened to the wall is one of the short edges. Unless your rooms are very high indeed, or unless you are prepared to fight your battles almost on the floor, this will restrict the size of your table to a maximum of 6x4. I have to say I've never come across anyone mad enough to screw a table onto their wall for wargaming purposes, although saying that, I do have a dedicated 3-metre hobby workbench and shelves that I built myself. Regardless, the board should be mounted with a timber surround as described previously, and some provision made for fixing it to the wall. A wooden batten will have to be attached to the wall itself, which calls for a masonry drill, as the wall will need to be drilled and plugged before the wooden batten can be screwed into place. I'm assuming plasterboard wasn't really used that much back then. The drawing shows how the hinge is fitted to the batten and to the wooden edging support of the board. Note that if your wall-mounted batten is wider than the depth of the wooden edging, it will provide support for the table whether it is up against the wall or down in play. It is best to fix the board to the hinge with bolts, as this makes it far easier to remove. Some provision must be made to secure the table against the wall, such as a couple of hook and eye arrangements, otherwise the whole lot will inevitably come crashing down at some point. As the board is only supported at one end, some additional support will be required at the other, such as a trestle, bookcase, bed, headboard, etc. It is better to place the wall batten at such a height that it makes use of whatever support you have handy, rather than find yourself looking around for suitable support once the project is almost complete. As an alternative to hinging your board against the wall, why not simply build a low shelf with a lip as shown here? The board stands upon this shelf but is otherwise unattached to it, although additional hooks in the wall will be necessary to prevent accidents. When in use, the board's edging hooks over the lip of the shelf to secure it. It may be that for whatever reason a proper games table is totally out of the question, in which case you can still use the floor. Terrain on the tabletop. Just as a real battlefield would be crisscrossed with hedges, dotted with buildings and studded with hills, so our model battlefield also has its own terrain features. Scenery is almost as important as the model troops. A model hill, for example, not only adds to the realism of the battlefield, but also forms an important tactical consideration. It is possible to buy scenery from model shops, although most gamers prefer to make their own. It's not difficult to make your own scenery, as the following examples show. Hills. The rise and fall of real hill contours creates blind spots, vantage points and defensible positions. The Wargames table is, of course, basically flat, although it is impossible to create depressions in the table. Hills are easily represented by one of several methods. The most popular means of making a model hill is to use either polystyrene ceiling tiles or pieces of chipboard. Ceiling tiles are easier to cut, but less robust. They will also collapse if painted or glued with inappropriate materials. PVA glue is very good, and emulsion paints are best for adding colour. In appearance, however, there is little difference between ceiling tiles and chipboard when placed on the tabletop. To make a hill, a rough circular shape with an approximate diameter of 8 inches is first cut from the tile or board. This is the base area of the hill. A smaller circle is cut and glued on top of this to give a two-step hill. Further, successively smaller areas can be glued on to make the hill higher. The important thing to remember is that each step must be large enough for models to stand on without them falling over. Stepped hills are very convenient because it becomes easy to see which models are on a higher slope. It is also very easy to see which hills are higher than others, an important consideration when it comes to overlooking the enemy's position. Woods. Woods are difficult to move or fire through, and so help delineate areas on the battlefield. A wood can be represented on the tabletop by marking out its boundaries with lichen or flock, coloured sawdust, or by using a piece of green card cut to the size of the wood if you are a cheapskate. The wood can be finished by placing a few modelled trees inside the boundary or on top of the card. Trees must often be moved during a battle to allow troops to pass, but the wood's boundaries are still clearly marked, and no confusion should arise. Modelled trees, lichen and flock can be bought from any model shop which stocks model railway accessories. Most craft stores like Hobbycraft do too. Hedges. Hedges provide cover for troops and conceal areas directly behind them. Although it is possible to buy hedge models from toy model shops, it is very easy to make your own. A simple line of lichen will suffice, although loose lichen tends to migrate across the battlefield during hostilities. Ideally, lichen should be glued to a card base to give it stability. Hedges can also be made from lengths of sponge or even loofah cut to shape. Walls. Walls are like hedges in that they provide cover. However, they are more solid than hedges and so make better cover. It is possible to buy model walls. Those sold in conjunction with plastic toy farm models are excellent. Walls can be represented by a line of stone chippings or small pebbles. For a more permanent setup, chippings or cobbles can be glued onto a card or wooden base with other chippings glued on top to build up the wall. Ditches. Ditches are not necessarily sheer trenches. A shallow drainage ditch can provide excellent cover. A convenient way of representing a ditch is to lay down a strip of black card or paper. The edges of the ditch can then be built up with plasticine, lichen, flock or some other loose material to disguise the edges. Can't say I've tried this. I have seen some great World War I style trenches out there though, but that entails building modular tiles and means lots of packing material to bring the basic level of the battlefield higher to account for the depth of the trenches themselves. Buildings. The Citadel card buildings available in packs are ideal for use with Warhammer, as well as being reasonably well priced. It is possible to buy model buildings made from resin too, but these are more expensive. You can also build your own using card or plywood. I guess we should probably add into the mix 3D printing these days too. Yes, that exists, but also laser cut MDF is a really great way of creating large buildings that are relatively light compared to resin or 3D printed versions. Rivers. Rivers and streams divide a battlefield into distinct areas or zones. The most popular method of representing rivers is to build river sections, each about 12 inches long. Several straight and curved sections will be necessary, as well as a section with a ford or bridge across the water. The most convenient material to use is the ubiquitous polystyrene ceiling tile. The disadvantage of this is that the river will be artificially raised above the table, but once the edges are covered with flock or lichen, this is hardly discernible. Sections can be any width. A good standard is 4 inches for a river and 2 inches for a stream. Cut the sections slightly irregularly. Banks can be built up with smaller strips of polystyrene along either edge and decorated with lichen, flock, etc. Once the section has been glued together, it can be painted. The most attractive colour scheme is to paint the water dark blue-green, gradating to a paler colour towards the banks. The banks themselves are muddy brown at the water's edge and green to match the tabletop. A few small stones placed in the stream will look good, especially with white streaks painted around them to follow the water flow. Once finished, a heavy layer of varnish will make the water look far more realistic. Bridges and fords are made in the same way as other river sections. A model bridge may be bought and built into the river section. The Citadel card building packs feature several such bridges. Fords are shallow parts of the river where troops may cross to the other side. A ford should be about 4 inches wide and is marked by small stones placed in the river. Banks can be lowered and painted brown to represent the ground sign of the path across. And the ford itself can be painted a paler colour to represent shallow water. Pools can be made in the same way as river sections, except that they are roughly circular. Some gamers even go to the lengths of decorating their pools with fallen branches and little plastic ducks. I've got to say, I haven't seen that before, but there's a first time for everything. Bogs. Bogs, mires and areas of muddy or difficult ground may be represented by marking out an area with lichen or flock and sprinkling a layer of appropriately coloured flock inside. Alternatively, a coloured piece of card may be used. And if you're a real professional, you'll take inspiration from swamps in movies like Lord of the Rings and Krull. Making the most of Citadel card buildings. The Citadel range of card buildings have been designed for use with the Warhammer game, and with the special needs of gamers in mind. The models are pre-printed in full colour onto good quality card sheets. Assembly is simply a matter of cutting out the individual wall sections and gluing them together using a suitable contact adhesive. Buildings vary in complexity from simple huts to full-size mansions, watermills and inns. Several special pieces are available, including bridges, a well and a mine entrance. Compared to the high cost of solid resin wargames buildings, these represent excellent value. Card buildings are robust and will survive many battles if carefully looked after. They can be made even stronger if you're prepared to do a bit of modelling. With a little extra work, you can personalise your models by adding scenic flock, extra windows, doors, etc. Bases. Your buildings can be made much stronger simply by adding a solid card base. Cut a piece of heavy cards large enough to accommodate the finished building. Glue the wall sections directly to the card base, using a set square to get a true right angle for the walls. Very professional, I might add. Cut the base tabs on the wall sections as large as possible to give a good surface area for the glued bond. Strengthening. Once all the walls are in position, cut out 4 triangles from waste card and glue them into the 4 corners. This will help the walls to stay in place. Cut another 4 pieces of card, and this time rectangles about 3 centimeters broad by the height of the wall section. Fold these rectangles along the long side to produce a length of card with an L section. These pieces are then glued at the inside of the wall joints to further strengthen them. Large buildings can be strengthened further by gluing cross pieces to hold the walls together across the top. If you don't do this, the roof will probably come adrift from the top of the walls. Roofs. The roof is fastened by tabs at the top of the wall sections. If any wall section does not have tabs, it is a good idea to make your own by gluing a piece of card along the inside. Most roofs are the apex variety with a ridge. In this case, it is recommended that the tabs be fixed in place by gluing triangular pieces of scrap card where they meet. This also serves to increase the area available for gluing. A separate ridge piece can be glued along the top at the same time, keeping the end walls from collapsing inwards at the top. I have to admit, I'd forgotten just how over the top some of these modifications were. Either that or the studio were playing rugby with their card buildings. Not that I'm complaining, there's nothing quite like over-engineering things. I am a fan of that. Outhouses. Outhouses, porches and towers are constructed as separate sections and glued into place. This will pose no problems so long as each section is constructed carefully. It is worth making sure that there is a tab where every piece joins another, and if there isn't one, then you should make one. Embellishments. Once your model is finished, you may wish to embellish it further. There is almost no limit to the extent to which this can be done, but there are a few simple steps that everyone should find easy. Colouring. Where roofs overhang, the white reverse side of the card will show. This can also occur where parapets show above the walls. Areas of white should be painted over using Citadel colour or similar paint. Lichen. All houses acquire a covering of moss, lichen and sun-dry natural deposits. Dab a little PVA glue against a wall or onto a roof and sprinkle green flock onto it to represent moss. This can be done most effectively in areas that might be damp, such as in gullies, recessed corners, or under overhanging roof tiles. Climbing plants such as ivy can be modelled by gluing lichen into place. Chimneys. Chimney stacks can be made by gluing a short length of drinking straw to the top of a building. Perfectionists may wish to add a wisp of cotton wool to represent smoke, although who would be lighting a fire when there are rampaging hordes of orcs and goblins outside their door is anyone's guess. Good stuff. I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I did researching and rereading my battered old copy of Warhammer Fantasy Battle. Let me know what techniques you used to use or still do today in the comments below. Anyways, thanks very much for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.